Now you've read some William Paley, you'll recognize the allusion to Paley's example in this 1986 book by Richard Dawkins. Paley was apparently a happy man. At the end of his life, he lived in a magnificent house in the north of England, which sadly no longer exists. I imagine Paley sitting out in his garden in summer, smelling the flowers and listening to the hum of bees, contemplating the beauty of creation. There is a lot of beauty and goodness, of course, but there's a lot of ugliness and evil too. At the beginning of the 19th century, when Paley's book was published, the childhood mortality rate in England was enormous. About 1 in 3 children didn't make it to their 5th birthday. How could an all-loving God allow that to happen? This is the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering. The problem of evil and the argument from evil are closely connected, but it's helpful to distinguish them. I shall use evil and suffering interchangeably. The problem of evil is, how can God allow evil or suffering? And the argument from evil departs from a negative answer to that first question, a negative answer to the problem of evil. God would not allow evil, but there is evil, so there is no God. Louise Antony endorses the argument from evil, and Eleanor Stump defends theism against the argument. The argument from evil tries to establish that God does not exist, or that it's unlikely that God exists, appealing to the observation that there is suffering of a certain kind. We'll get onto the certain kind in a moment. Question for you: does the argument proceed a priori or a posteriori? Please hit the pause button, or just press K and answer the question. Well, the answer here is pretty easy. The argument proceeds a posteriori because it appeals to a premise that can only be known through observation, namely that there is suffering of a certain kind. As usual, it's important to be clear on what we mean by God. In the fine-tuning argument, the operative notion of God was the architect and creator of the universe. Here, in the argument from evil, we're back to God, as in the ontological argument. The operative notion is an absolutely perfect being, a being who is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Let me remind you of the fine-tuning argument, the conclusion of which is: the universe was designed and built by some agent with the aim of allowing the universe to permit life. Another question for you: could you accept both the fine-tuning argument, which is pro-God, the conclusion of which is God exists, and the argument from evil, which is anti-God, the conclusion of which is that God doesn't exist? Please press K again. Yes, you! Pause the video. The answer is yes, you can, because there are different senses of God in the two arguments. The conclusion of the fine-tuning argument is that the universe had a creator. The conclusion of the argument from evil is that there is no absolutely perfect being. And obviously those two conclusions are compatible, because the creator of the universe might not be a perfect being, indeed may be considerably imperfect, perhaps highly malevolent. Here's a way of setting out the argument from evil or suffering. Compare Louise Antony's version on pages 39 to 40 of the Norton Anthology, I've set it out in the form of a reductio ad absurdum. So the first premise is God exists. That is the assumption for our reductio. That is the assumption that we're going to reduce to absurdity. The second premise is if God exists, he creates a world in which there is evil only if there is a good reason to create such a world. We support that premise with the claim that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. And premise 3 is there is no good reason to create a world in which there is evil, from which it follows that there is no evil. But, this is the reductio part, observation shows us that C is false. Of course there is evil. So by a form of argument called reductio ad absurdum, please look that up in the glossary, P1 is false. Reductio ad absurdum is the kind of argument that you find in mathematics. So remember the proof that root 2 is irrational. That starts from the assumption that root 2 is not irrational, that it's a rational number. And the proof that root 2 is irrational proceeds by reducing that assumption to absurdity.